Good evening, and on behalf of the Royal Irish Academy, welcome to this online lecture by Arnold Horner, Man, Maps and Map History, in honour of John Andrews, geographer and cartographic historian who died last November 2019. I am Sarah Gearty, cartographic and managing editor of the Irish Historic Towns Atlas, one of the Royal Irish Academy's research projects. Professor John Andrews was one of the founding editors of this project, and as his colleagues and friends in that endeavour, we in the Irish Historic Towns Atlas are delighted to be hosting this lecture. We had hoped to hold this event in Academy House, Dawson Street, Dublin. John was a member of the Royal Irish Academy and made significant contributions to the Academy's Atlas of Ireland and proceedings, but of course, the pleasure of such a gathering is impossible at present. One joy is that so many beyond Dublin City and County can join with us this evening. Welcome. Dr. Arnold Horner is tonight's speaker. He is a graduate of the Geography Department in Trinity College Dublin, who went on to lecture in geography in University College Dublin. And many of us here this evening will have been introduced to the work of John Andrews and the world of maps and mapping through Arnold in UCD. His recent books, documents relating to the Bogs Commissioners 1809 to 13, published by the Irish Manuscripts Commission, and Mapping Laois, published by Wordwell, are fine examples of the depths of his own contribution to the history of maps and mapping in Ireland. Taking on the topic of John Andrews' life in maps is not an easy task. There is much to cover. We thank you, Arnold, for taking this on. We won't have the opportunity for comments or questions after Arnold's lecture, but we are delighted that Keith Lilley, Professor of Historical Geography in Queen's University Belfast, will respond to the lecture and offer some final thoughts. The whole session will take a little over an hour. It'll be available online afterwards. Once again, thank you for joining us this evening and enjoy.
Hello, I'm Arnold Horner, and I've known John Andrews over a 55-year period from the mid-1960s as a scholar, as a teacher, and as a friend, and I'm delighted to try to offer an appreciation of his work as a man, as a map historian, and to introduce some of the maps that he was associated with and that interested him during his long academic career. Anyone who seeks to explore the life and impact of John Andrews is immediately presented with a challenge. John was not only a distinguished scholar, he was also a prolific writer, and a writer of original and high-quality material at that. He had over 250 publications to his name by the time of his death in late 2019. His written work and record is quite dauntingly impressive. And to this we must add his contributions as a one-time president of the Geographical Society of Ireland, as a member of the Royal Irish Academy, as an editor of publications, and as an academic leader in general. All that can be done here is to offer a partial assessment of John Andrews, which is met by considerable personal selectivity on my part and by the vast presentation of a large number of slides. The focus is on his work as a map historian with particular reference to Ireland. Only brief acknowledgement can be made of his contributions to a wider arena, notably to the broad field of Irish historical cartography and geography, and to map history in general. Even with these restrictions, a serious review in a short space is not easy. Over his academic life, John Andrews left few areas of Irish map history untouched. It is a challenge to highlight his work and to offer a perspective on both the man and the map historian. Fortunately, various people, among them those listed here, have helped by providing information or comment. Our task has been further helped by some material already available. At the time of John's retirement, about 1990, Fred Olin and Kevin Whelan had the foresight to edit a book of essays to celebrate John's achievements. These essays focused mainly on Dublin City and County, arguably a core area for much of John's academic activity. But three of the contributions related directly to John himself. These were an appreciation by Joe Houghton, his longtime colleague and head of the Geography Department at Trinity College, an appraisal of John as an historical geographer by Dr. Kevin Whelan, and a bibliography of John's writings up to 1991 compiled by Richard Howarth and Mary Davies. As it is now clear, these were but interim assessments, as John remained highly active as a scholar long after his official retirement. These sources can be further developed and updated by two memoir essays that John himself wrote much more recently. A Civilian's Memories of World War II, The Wartime Experience, describes his teenage years in wartime London. It is vivid, but not directly relevant to the present discussion. In contrast, his 20,000-word piece entitled My Life in Map History, which he re-edited as late as 2017, is highly relevant, offering many insights laced with dry humour on how John himself perceived a central aspect of his life journey. I have been fortunate to benefit from each of these sources, but especially from My Life in Map History, to which I will refer later. John Andrews spent his early years in southeast England. He had been born in Streatham, an inner city part of South London, on May the 27th, 1927. His father was a comfortably off accountant. His mother had been a teacher. In 1932, when John was just 5, his mother died. John subsequently spent a couple of years in boarding school, at the end of which, following the remarriage of his father, the family moved to the suburban fringe to Sanderstead, a little south of Croydon. With the exception of a few months at the start of World War II, John was to live in Sanderstead for the rest of his school days. Where John grew up had a profound influence on the growth of his interest in geography. Not only was he living on the edge of a great city, he was also on the edge of an area that he himself described as one of England's classic landscapes, a region where geographical relationships were beautifully articulated. This region was the chalklands of the North Downs, an area that was also to stimulate his interest in maps at the age of around 15. Many decades later, in My Life in Map History, he selected three maps that he felt had been influential in developing his enthusiasm for cartography. Significantly, each of these maps refers to the North Downs area. The first of these was the map of the county of Surrey made by John Roke and published about 1768. A map that, in John's words, classified every part of the land's surface, the ultimate cartographic achievement. Second was a British 1 inch to 1 mile Ordnance Survey map the relief edition of sheet 125, published in 1936. Covering a substantial part of the North Downs, this map was especially admired by John for its beautiful hill shading and newly designed script. Third was the wartime and presumably secret version of a larger 1 to 25,000 scale map covering the area around Sanderstead. This was, for John, an early introduction to the underworld of irregular and unrecognised maps that cartographic scholars take so much pride in resurrecting. To these early influences, John later added another map that in retrospect he recognised as a possible all-time favourite. This was an early printed edition of the Ordnance Survey of Ireland, 6 inches to 1 mile, covering the Dublin city area, more specifically County Dublin, sheet 18, 1844 edition. In all its many 19th century versions, nearly 20 of them, sheet 18 was to fascinate John as he walked the streets it depicted over 3 decades. A scholarship brought John to King's College, Cambridge in autumn 1944. For the next 3 years, he took the BA course in geography. John's undergraduate years were thus during a period when war gave way to an era of great austerity, as Britain struggled to recover and rebalance. His Cambridge experience was in some respects also austere, with few of the frills that later marked student life. He took a second-year course on historical geography from the later well-known Jean Mitchell, and as far as maps were concerned, he recalls that there was very little exposure to large-scale examples. His lecturers thought small-scale. It was also the case that almost all instruction was by relatively junior members of staff. Nevertheless, he was given a far more wide-ranging exposure to cartography than would be the case today. 3 afternoons a week were spent on practical work during a first year that included an intensive course on surveying. John completed his Cambridge degree in 1947 with a significant distinction, winning the undergraduate prize of the Royal Geographical Society for an essay entitled "The Arrangement and Distribution of Rural Habitations." The next 2 years were given over to his then compulsory national service. John was stationed at the Army Apprentice School near the Welsh borderland town of Chepstow. It was while in Chepstow that John met Doris Hoskins, whom he married in 1951. Doris, by whom John is now survived, was to be an unobtrusive but constant support to John during his academic career. On discharge, John spent the next 4 years teaching in secondary modern schools in Surrey. At the same time, he continued his academic interest, registering as an external student for a PhD at London University. In 1954, John completed his thesis entitled "Geographical Aspects of the Maritime Trade of Kent and Sussex, 1600 to 1750. This was a foray into historical geography that introduced John to some of the great London record offices. Many years later, John completed 2 further theses, both of them for master's degrees at Trinity College Dublin, and both of them on very different topics, about which more will be said a little later. 1954 was also the year of a decisive career shift. An appointment to a junior lectureship at Trinity marked both a move to Ireland and a move to full-time academic life. Doris and John settled in Dublin, first at a flat in Harrington Street, and then from the late 1950s in an apartment in Leeson Park. These places were enough for John, who never drove, to walk to Trinity, often twice a day, as he regularly returned home to lunch. In Trinity, John was based in an office high up in the recently fitted out geography department in the museum building. He had undertaken little overseas travel. Otherwise, John ventured into the unknown world of Dublin rather well equipped. Unlike many young lecturers of that period, he was fully fitted with his PhD, and he had had both army and teaching experience. He had lived in both a great city and in a great university, and in wartime he had had the experience of summer work on farms. This diverse background was undoubtedly an asset for the challenge of adjusting to mid-1950s Trinity. In my life, John recalled how in a geography department then comprising just 3 staff members, there were many lectures to deliver, and some of them were on what for him were long neglected subjects like geomorphology and climatology. In his early years, his teaching appears to have been especially diverse, extending to lectures on economic and political geography and even onto China, before settling on more enduring courses on historical geography and Britain, and in the 1970s to a contribution to a first-year practical class on mapping. Customizing his classes for Ireland was also an issue. In relation to his historical geography course, John recognised that he had to learn about Ireland, a task not made easier by the dearth of relevant literature. The task of adapting to Ireland was also an issue for John's research agenda. His publications during the 1950s focused in part on expanding his thesis work on the ports of southeast England, in part on a series of short pieces about a range of Irish themes like livestock statistics, the early iron industry, ports, the Irish border. He also gave time, with the encouragement of Gerald Sims, to investigating the potential of the 17th century Down survey as a source of socio-economic statistics. However, it was really only in the early 1960s that John's research crystallized into what became a career focus. The defining event was the Ireland in Maps exhibition, held in 1961 to 62 in the long room of Trinity College Library. John was a central figure in the organisation of this exhibition, which was officially under the direction of the Geographical Society of Ireland in conjunction with the Ordnance Survey of Ireland. However, it was John that did much of the heavy lifting, assembling and arranging the exhibits, and crucially, writing an accompanying commentary and catalogue. This was the point when, as John put it, his life in map history really began. As the commentary and catalogue booklet clearly indicate, the exhibition was mostly about the development of mapping in Ireland over a 400-year period. For John, its impact was both short-term and long-term. An immediate consequence was a reflective article in Irish Geography which John called Ireland in Maps, a Bibliographical Postscript. In this, he reviewed aspects of Ireland's mapping experience in the period before the advent of the Ordnance Survey in the early 19th century. With this article, John can be seen defining a future research agenda where, as he put it, he sought to identify issues unanswered in earlier work, to stimulate further research, and to suggest further lines of inquiry. That agenda was to play out over a very long period. In fact, 48 years later, When John was by then aged 82, he published one of his final books, and it was entitled Maps in Those Days. This was a title which, as John explained, had its genesis in the Ireland in Maps exhibition of the early 1960s. Sometime during that exhibition, he had been asked the question, how did they make maps in those days? His 576-page book of 2009 was his attempt, after nearly half a century, to produce a comprehensive answer to that inquiry. It was a book that had been enriched by sustained research that had both collaborative and personal dimensions. In the years that followed the Maps exhibition, John contributed to many collaborative projects. He wrote large numbers of book chapters, for example, but two major projects deserve particular notice. In the 1970s, he acted as secretary to the small committee led by Professor Joe Houghton that brought the Royal Irish Academy's Atlas of Ireland to publication in 1979. John did much of the coordination for this project, which involved academics from across Ireland. Some years later, in 1981, John agreed to act as editor alongside Angrid Sims for another project that came under the auspices of the Academy. This was the proposed Irish Historic Towns Atlas, to which over the following decade, and indeed later when he was consultant editor, he gave much time and energy. In the early stages of this project, John was pivotal in establishing a robust, durable series of parameters that could be applied to each town covered by the atlas, regardless of its size or origins. He was also an early contributor. In 1986, completing the first piece to be published on Kildare Town, and acting later as joint author with Mary Davies for the fourth piece on Mullingar, which was published in 1991. John was to recall later that this was mainstream historical geography rather than cartographic history, but it certainly taught me a great deal about early Irish town plans. For much of the 1960s, and indeed for much longer, John's more personal research agenda can be seen as following two broad routes. The first displays his growing confidence in writing about Ireland and Irish historical geography, most notably in some of his general essays contributions to the projects of historians writing about Ireland. For the 1967 television series, The Course of Irish History, John provided an opening preview, a geographer's view of Irish history. He later contributed several essays to the long-running New History of Ireland project, writing about land and landscape in the 17th and 18th centuries, and providing another reflective overview piece on the geographical element in Irish history. Alongside these broad perspectives, there were other much more focused articles, most notably an innovative piece in 1970 on geography and government in Elizabethan Ireland, and a series of conference papers, some never published, on aspects of Irish settlement history and geography. This is in itself a very wide-ranging agenda, but time and space do not permit exploring this further here. For the present, our concern must be on John's other major route, that marking his journey through Irish map history. Again, a broad sweep, but also a journey with two quite distinct paths. One of these paths led to the vast, partly unsorted records of the Ordnance Survey of Ireland, records which were then concentrated at the survey's headquarters at Mountjoy House in the Phoenix Park. The other path led to an exploration of the earlier mapping of Ireland over almost 300 years before the advent of the survey. This latter path was and is much less clearly defined. In places it is well marked, elsewhere the tracks are faint or non-existent. But wherever you are along this pre-survey route, the task is complex, involving diverse records from a multiplicity of sources located in both Ireland and Britain. The challenge in navigating even one of these unexplored paths would have been formidable. To travel both paths was, however, exceptional, an achievement in historical investigation that can perhaps arguably be described as of heroic proportions. Many years later, some great books emerged from these journeys. The records of the Ordnance Survey stretch back to the establishment of the survey in 1824. As well as maps in various stages of completion, there is much documentary supporting material, including field notebooks and the manuscript letter books that record relations with other administrative branches of the state and also how key decisions were made. These records are all the more significant because many of the British equivalents were lost or destroyed by wartime bombing. The Irish records therefore offer a fairly unique insight on how topographic mapping developed during the 19th century. John Andrews mined these records with skill and diligence, and over the course of a decade, this non-driver regularly took the number 10 bus to the Phoenix Park and then walked 2 kilometres to the survey's offices. He was to become a familiar figure at Mountjoy House as a future survey director, then only recently recruited, noted in his memoirs. Richard Dick Kerwin recalled in 2010 how he had often met this pale-faced man with thick-rimmed glasses emerging from the manuscript stores or ascending the stairs from the rat-friendly basement of Mountjoy House. I was told, said Richard Kerwin, he was a researcher, but nobody seemed to take any notice of him. He was a serious man, engrossed in his work, who always seemed to be mentally juggling with some complicated puzzle or mining the depths of his mind for some lost scraps of information. John spent every minute of his available time searching the records, seeking information to piece together the story of map making in Ireland. That work in the rat-friendly basement ultimately resulted in 2 seminal texts. First, a short 64-page booklet, History in the Ordnance Map, which offered a concise guide to the diversity of the maps and other records associated with the Ordnance Survey of Ireland. Second, what is in effect a definitive history of the survey before 1922. A paper landscape takes the reader from the early preparatory phase of the survey as it established the framework for large-scale mapping through to its later diversification to provide maps of all scales by the end of the century. Published in 1975, a paper landscape had an impact in various directions. One that troubled John from time to time was that it served as an input to Brian Friel's play Translations. Considering that Friel's interpretation was specious and that he had maligned the survey, John on at least 2 occasions sought to set the record straight, with what, if any, impact is hard to say. A happier consequence of John's research was his growing interest in the maps of Dublin. Indeed, already in 1973, he had published an article on County Dublin Sheet 18, the Ordnance Survey 6-inch map of the Dublin city area of the 1844 edition of which he had described in My Life as being possibly his all-time favourite. Meticulously examining nearly 20 states and printings that were made of Sheet 18 over a 60-year period from 1838, John was able to show how map detail might deviate from reality on the ground. This was a forensic study that came to be internationally acclaimed. It is one of a number of Dublin map studies by John, two of which were made to accompany facsimile reproductions, one of these being of maps of Dublin City and County by John Roke between 1756 and 1760, the other being of Brooking's map of the city of Dublin, made originally in 1728. These studies led in turn to a further article which appeared in the Proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy in 1983. Entitled The Oldest Map of Dublin, this article examined the representation of the city, which appeared as an inset on John Speed's map of Leinster dated 1610. John undertook this study for the 10th International Conference on the History of Cartography, which was held with John as conference chairman in Dublin in 1983. Over 30 years later, in My Life, his memoir, John was to refer to this conference as the high point in his map historical life. Consideration of these early maps of Dublin brings us to the second major line of inquiry in John's map history journey. Investigating Irish maps from the period before the Ordnance Survey required a different approach to the harvest John had found in the Phoenix Park. John was now the hunter-gatherer. Many of the earlier maps existed only in unique manuscripts, and John had to piece together his information from diverse sources. His inquiries led him to repositories in Britain, as well as to the libraries, record offices, and some of the principal private houses in Ireland. Among John's early map history interests was a focus on two men who, in very different ways and in very different periods, played major roles in Irish mapping. Charles Vallancey was a founder member of the Royal Irish Academy. Indeed, his portrait occupies a place of honour in its reception room. During the last quarter of the 18th century, he directed a series of military surveys across much of Ireland, one outcome of which was a huge 3-metre high manuscript map of Ireland made about 1785. Much admired by John, a characteristically meticulous analysis of this and other Vallancey maps became the subject of an article published in the Geographical Journal in 1966. The pioneer work of the Elizabethan-era mapmaker Robert Lythe was undertaken over 2 centuries earlier. Lythe worked for the English government in Ireland during the period 1567 to 1571. Although most of the north was still too dangerous, Lythe made reconnaissance trips across large parts of the south and centre, assembling enough information to create what was perhaps the first map of Ireland whose maker had himself seen the country. Most of what remains of Lythe's work is at Petworth House in Sussex and in London at what are now the British Library and the National Archives. The significance of Laois' work is that he appears to have drawn the image of Ireland that other map makers would use for the next 40 years. Laois' shape, created in 1570, appeared on the later maps of Hondius, Mercator, Speed, and in 1599, Boazio. How Laois influenced a man like Boazio, who was working 30 years later, is certainly evident when you look at the shape of the Kerry peninsulas. As early as 1965, John highlighted Laois' significance for Ireland in the international journal Imago Mundi. Laois' work remained of great interest to John for the rest of his life. It was a disappointment to him that so few historians appeared to appreciate Laois. Another early focus was on the maps in the National Library of Ireland. A particular attraction of the library was that it could be easily visited. Like the Academy, it was on John's regular walking route from his home in Leeson Park to his office in Trinity. He could easily call in when going home to lunch, as he did most days. He could even return there in the evening. As much as Trinity itself, the National Library was part of his staple research diet during John's years in Dublin. Quite apart from its maps, its great collection of early newspapers was a major attraction. To judge from his publications, John spent lengthy periods sampling early newspapers for the advertisements and other references to maps and to surveyors. One of John's first forays in the National Library was to investigate its unique collection of early 19th century manuscript roads maps. Compiled between 1805 and 1817, these maps were made to identify the roads that would be laid out or improved for the then relatively new mail coach services. In 1964, John used these maps in conjunction with the legislative documents associated with the establishment of the earlier turnpike roads to produce a definitive article on the theme of road planning in Ireland before the railway age. John's engagement with the estate and farm maps in the National Library and also elsewhere was much more prolonged. In part, this was because of the sheer volume of these maps, but other reasons for John's long involvement included the delay that arose during the 1970s when the library withdrew its map collection from public access for over 6 years, and also because John decided he had enough material to write a book on the history of the Irish land surveyor, a book which eventually appeared in 1985. Even then, John's interest in local maps continued, as he was committed to an ambitious project that sought to assemble for Britain and Ireland a directory, or as the project called it, a dictionary of local land surveyors and map makers who had operated at one time or another over the long period starting around 1530 and ending around 1850. John undertook much of the Irish work for this project, which ran for over 30 years and only ended in 1997. Some particular landmark publications can be identified in John's researches into estate and farm maps. A publication in Irish Geography in 1967 is especially significant as it offers a framework for understanding the history of the Irish estate map. Entitled The French School of Dublin Land Surveyors, this article explored the pivotal role of the celebrated John Roke and his brother-in-law Bernard Scally in estate map-making in Ireland. We have already met Roke as the author of county maps of Surrey and of Dublin, and indeed as a maker of other important printed maps. John now highlighted how Roke had, in the late 1750s, compiled over 170 beautifully illustrated maps depicting the estates of the Earl of Kildare. These maps, which set a new standard for estate mapmaking in Ireland, had been placed on sale in London in the early 1960s, and it was soon after that John, as it were, discovered them. They include some beautiful town plans of towns in County Kildare. The 1985 book is the main outcome of John's work into estate and farm maps. Subtitled An Historical Study of the Irish Land Surveyor, Plantation Acres is a book that is cast widely. Going back to the early 16th century and to the plantations of the later part of that century, and also looking at such topics as those surveyors who broke into print by, for example, creating county maps, or by occasionally creating town or city maps. Indeed, this is a book that goes far beyond maps to explore much about the evolution of land measures, surveying practices, and surveying instruments, and also the prejudices, often virulent, of the practitioners. Many of these topics had never really been systematically appraised before John Andrews. He patiently built his book over many years to create a remarkable synthesis from a diversity of sources, including thousands of small advertisements from over 100 years of general and local newspapers. The outcome is a really quite exceptional achievement, a far-reaching and highly original review of the social and economic significance of land surveying in Ireland over a 300-year period. John Andrews produced so much of quality, but for me at least, I think I would rate this book as a particularly virtuoso performance. There's no other source really like it in terms of the history of cartography. In 1990, John took retirement from Trinity, and he moved with Doris to Chepstow, the Welsh borderland town where he had completed his national service over 40 years earlier. Notwithstanding his new location, John continued to publish extensively for the best part of another quarter of a century. But his work on Irish topics was now complemented by an expanded concern for the theoretical framework of map history. In particular, John found himself critical of those map historians who took what can loosely be described as postmodernist or structuralist approaches. He was especially sceptical of two leading writers on maps and map history, Brian Harley and Dennis Wood. Harley, who died in 1991, had throughout the 1980s pushed an approach that centred on a view of maps as social constructions, as a form of power knowledge. He argued that maps should be read as texts, that their silences, what they did not say, need to be recognised, and that they had to be deconstructed. Feeling this approach to scholarship to be quite pretentious, John wrote a long monograph that effectively sought to deconstruct Harley. He attempted a comparably forensic dissection of Dennis Wood, who in 1992 had authored the influential book The Power of Maps. Wood was especially concerned with codes and semiotics, the signals sent out by maps and other documents. In this instance, John wrote at such length and with such intensity that he produced a 181-page critique, which he submitted as a Masters of Science degree to Trinity College. This was, as John later expressed it, a project regarded by everyone within range as eccentric to the point of mental disturbance. Perhaps John himself also recognised its unusual nature. At any rate, he does not appear to have published anything as a direct follow-up to the Wood project. John's concern to promote greater rigour in map philosophy also led him to consider how a map might be defined. Over several years of wide-ranging inquiry, he assembled some 321 definitions to demonstrate how variously the word map had been interpreted over the long period 1649 to 1996. This investigation subsequently resulted in two short papers, quite intense papers, in the Canadian journal Cartographica and in Irish Geography. These articles, and indeed his longer monograph and thesis, were just elements of work across a broader front during retirement years. Maps in those days may be seen as representing the more technocratic, positivist approach that John favoured in his quest for rigour. Published in 2009, when John was aged 82, this book seeks to describe all stages of the mapping process, from conceptualization through the technical aspects of production to the final presentation. Living at Chepstow, the main sources for John's Irish research were now at some distance. Nevertheless, he continued to publish extensively on Irish topics. Visits to Dublin continued for some time, and various friends, including, among others, Paul Ferguson of the Trinity Map Library and his erstwhile PhD student Matthew Stout, kept him in touch with Dublin views and Dublin news. John was also able to make day trips to London. He was a regular attender at the monthly Warburg lectures on the history of cartography, and he was also able to use the University of Bristol Library. Over time, his interest appeared to rest increasingly on aspects of Irish map history before 1630. Many Irish maps from this period were in English libraries and archives, and John could investigate them whilst also pursuing an emerging concern with the map representation of late 16th century England. In 2005, he composed and circulated, but did not publish, a draft list of what he termed the regional maps of Ireland made before 1630. Earlier, he had written general articles on how maps recorded the cultural and physical landscapes of Ireland in the early modern period. He had also returned to the early work of Robert Lythe and had contributed articles on the place names on Lythe's Irish maps. His articles included studies of the post-Armada cartography of Galway City, on John Speed's map of Ulster, and in collaboration with the architectural historian Rolf Lober, on the famed map of Laois and Offaly made about 1560. He also published 2 lengthy reviews in the Proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy on the mapping of Western Ireland during the 1580s and on John Norden's general maps of Ireland compiled during 1607 and 1608. In addition to these articles and to the long project that resulted in Maps in Those Days, John also wrote 2 further books. Like Plantation Acres, Shapes of Ireland, published in 1997, covers a near 300-year period, in this instance from 1564 to 1839. However, in contrast to the Plantation Acres' concern with local maps, Shapes of Ireland focuses mainly on single-sheet maps depicting the whole of Ireland. Taking a selection of what he considered to be the most innovative breakthrough maps, John reviewed some of the country's best known maps and map makers: Mercator, Boazio, Speed, Petty, Valency, Beaufort and Arrowsmith, as well as some of those who are perhaps lesser known, men such as Henry Pratt and Thomas Jeffreys. As always with John's work, there is also much local detail and collateral information. For example, on place names, on the evolution of the roads network, and on such topics as military barracks. Here too is another theme that had intermittently interested John: measurement tests for map accuracy, a topic he had first visited in the 1970s with James Killen and Joan Murphy, and to which he now returned with the aid of an innovative computer program refined by Matthew Stout and Helen McMahon. 12 years later, at the age of 82, and in 2009, the same year as Maps in Those Days appeared, came John's final book on Irish map history. Perhaps appropriately, its focus was on the Elizabethan cartographer, the Queen's last mapmaker, he called it, the Elizabethan cartographer Richard Bartlett. It was about his activities in Ireland between 1600 and 1603. Compiled like a detective story, this book contextualized the work of a mapmaker and military engineer who was at the Siege of Kinsale and who accompanied the English forces advancing into Gaelic Ulster in 1603. Bartlett was treated as a spy while he was in Donegal and he was beheaded. But before that, he had compiled a unique series of maps depicting the Ulster he encountered. Among his images is a remarkable scene of the city of Armagh as it lay in ruins about the year 1600, a unique record that reveals an urban structure that was already complex in the pre-plantation period. By the time his final books had appeared, John had already taken steps to wind down his map history research. In 2005, with the assistance of Dr. Jacinta Prunty, he arranged for most of his personal map history library to be transferred to Maynooth University. Some 670 books and 2,300 pamphlets covering all aspects of map history were thus made available as a resource for readers in Ireland. With this gift, however, John also greatly reduced his options for further work on Irish map history. His research work now became essentially curtailed to occasional book reviews, occasional book chapters, and to short articles, including a couple on topics related to the Chepstow Gwent area. Perhaps it is appropriate, however, that what may prove to have been his final publication was focused on a review of plantation surveys for the long-delayed Volume 4 of the Chicago University History of Cartography project, which was published in 2020. It was surely fitting that this final work communicated to a general international readership. Although increasingly challenged by the impact of Parkinson's disease, John continued to correspond and to take an interest in map history, including the Irish Historic Towns Atlas project, until shortly before he died. For over a decade, he interacted at length with the Irish Manuscripts Commission, and much more recently, he updated his personal memoir on my life in map history. A year later, when my book on Mapping Laois appeared, he sent me some comments and later again a get well card. At 92, he still wanted to be active and interested. John Andrews died on the 15th of November 2019. He was buried at St. Arfan's Church near Chepstow on the 6th of December. He is survived by his wife Doris and by a half-brother David. His students and academic colleagues will remember him for many things, not least the clarity in his thinking, the clarity in his lectures, and the clarity in his writing. His prose style was both elegant and economic, and it was certainly rarely repetitive. Many of us will recall John's meticulously prepared lectures and some highly distinctive field trips. In the academic world, John's impact will be long-lasting. He was, and will be, respected by students, colleagues, local historians and researchers across Ireland and much further afield also. A great correspondent and always courteous, he gave generously of his time, and he was always willing to help others. He was also an excellent, thorough and encouraging supervisor of research. Above all, John will be remembered for a scholarship that reached out to so many and gave so much. With his far-reaching research across a broad front, John Andrews has almost single-handedly provided the framework for an appreciation of Ireland's map history. A commitment to various geography-oriented organisations and projects stands alongside his record of over 250 publications, many of them highly original pieces, and including 9 books, more than 130 articles and book chapters, over 100 reviews, and various introductions to facsimile reprints. John Andrews, who died on the 15th of November 2019, was truly a scholar who both made knowledge and, even more importantly, shared it to his colleagues and to the world. Thank you.
Hello and good evening. My name's Keith Lilley, and it's my pleasure to give a short response to the lecture you've just been hearing by Arnold Horner on man, maps and map history, a lecture in honour of the life and work of John Andrews, who sadly died last year. I'm going to give a short response in part to the lecture we've just been hearing about and some thoughts about it, but also some ideas perhaps which spring from that lecture about the legacy we might identify from the contribution that John Andrews has made over so many decades through his scholarship. It's his scholarship which is most striking for me as a fellow geographer. When I read John Andrews's books and his papers, and I listen to the words of Arnold, I would agree entirely with what we've just been hearing about from Arnold, and the kinds of phrases that he used in his lecture to me really struck a chord. The heroic proportions of John Andrews' work, for example, how his work is dauntingly impressive, and what a kind of challenge it is, and what a challenge John Andrews' work presents to us as scholars with shared interests in the history of cartography and in historical geography. When I read John Andrews' work, well, I'm thinking here of something like a paper landscape, which is here before me, and the level of scholarship is so impressive. It's such a detailed work, and it is almost actually intimidating, the level of detail, and yet it's such a readable piece of work and such an influential piece of work. So I really enjoyed listening to Arnold's lecture this evening, and the very broad compass that it provides of the work of John Andrews, his scholarship, and also I think the legacy. And what comes to me, what comes across very much, is how much John Andrews' work really has laid the foundations for us on the island of Ireland, but not just the island of Ireland, actually, way beyond these shores as well. The work of John Andrews in the history of cartography and historical geography really reaches far and wide. So I very much enjoyed hearing about the life and work of John Andrews. And I see from what we've just been hearing and seeing as examples, John Andrews very much as a kind of pioneer. And I don't know whether he would have seen himself as a pioneer, but for me now, hearing about that extraordinary career, encompassing so much richness and so much scholarship, I do see him as a pioneer. So what about then some thoughts on what we've just been hearing about? I think the first thing I'd like to say is how John Andrews embedded the history of cartography so well in historical geography, putting the two things together, and I think rightly so as well, of connecting historical geography with the history of cartography. And I think that is very much a part of being a geographer. For me anyway, an interest in maps, an interest in landscapes. And it's this bringing together of maps and landscapes in interesting ways, that interplay between map and landscape that we see through what we've just been hearing about John Andrews' work from Arnold Horner. And there are really kind of two key dimensions to that, aren't there? I suppose on the one hand, there is this eye for landscape, an eye for the landscape and its histories, and telling histories of landscapes through maps, both maps as sources, but also maps as a way of communicating visually. And I see then a reflection of the kind of sensitivities to our work as geographers coming through here very strongly, that eye for a landscape and an interest in landscape as well, really borne out through often, as we've seen through John Andrews' work, through a particular affinity to places belonging to our childhood, places belonging to where we work and where we find ourselves. So it's that affinity with landscape, which I think is a really important element of what we've been hearing about, and the role of maps within looking at landscapes. Another related aspect, I suppose, which struck me very strongly, was the experience John Andrews had as a cartographer. And now actually making maps is itself such a fundamental part of being a geographer, in my view. The background that we were introduced to there in terms of John's training as a geographer reminds us of how important it is when we are ourselves interested in maps to look behind the map, to think about the processes that created the map, through fieldwork, through survey, through drafting a map, through printing a map, through circulating it and consuming it. That whole process that we see through the map making and through the work of map makers as well, the experience of map making. And I think that insider view of cartography is really important in what we read in John Andrews's work. His understanding, again, of being that person in the field, and we see it in his work in Plantation Acres, in the paper landscape, in maps in those days. You know, these really significant pieces of work, which are on one hand, at least in part, about cartography, about maps, but they are also very much about maps from the field, or map making from the point of view of the map makers. So I think this is something which, again, is really quite distinctive and quite special in the contribution that John Andrews has made as a cartographic historian and also as an historical geographer, that eye for the landscape and his experience of map making. And what unites and connects both of those is the field, how the landscape itself draws us into the field as a particular site, as a locality, as something to try and understand, and how looking at map making is also something which draws us back to the field, back to those sites in the landscape which were surveyed, for example, by the surveyors all those decades or centuries ago. And the field, of course, is very much a part of being a geographer, is it not? You know, this is the place where we go. And for John Andrews, we see the field not just literally as a field out there in the landscape, but the field also in terms of an archive or a library. And the richness of the scholarship becomes, I think, through the joining of those two things. The field out there in the wider world, the landscape, so to speak, but also the field in terms of the archive or the library. Thinking about some legacies and potential future directions from listening to what we've just been hearing about from Arnold Horner, the two things again really struck me. One was John Andrews' interest in the accuracy in historic maps and the innovation that he brought to studying accuracy in historic maps and the computer-based approaches in particular. And this is something now which, thanks to the wonders of geographic information systems, is actually opening up some really interesting insights into the ways in which maps in the past were made. Interesting insights because GIS helps us to begin to identify patterns, for example, in distortion and accuracy, which from the naked eye are often hard to identify. But through using GIS and associated kinds of software of spatial analysis, we can begin to, if you like, excavate the map, to look behind the map, to think about the processes by which the map was made and perhaps how one map maker copied another map maker and so forth. And this sort of empirical approach, I think, is a good corollary to the critical cartography, which clearly from some of the discussion we've just been hearing about was something which exercised John Andrews quite a bit. And I think in many ways, actually, the kind of legacy we see in John Andrews's work, like a paper landscape, is very much, I think, a contribution, a major contribution actually, to critical cartography, or thinking about cartography in critical ways. Perhaps without the theoretical insights of somebody like Brian Harley, but nevertheless significant and complementary in helping us to ground some of those ideas. So accuracy in historic maps is one area of future direction, which we can build upon the legacy of John Andrews's work. The other future direction, which we might tease out, goes back to the field, I think, and the institutional history of the Ordnance Survey, for example, which we see in a paper landscape, is very much in vogue. Institutional histories are very much in vogue at the moment. Intellectual history, the history of science, the history of geography, and the history of cartography. And one thing we can begin to do, perhaps, through John Andrews's work, and I'm thinking here of a paper landscape, is to think about the field. The field through the archive, in the way that John Andrews approaches the field and the role of surveyors in surveying for the Ordnance Survey in the 19th century in Ireland, but also, again, in a complementary sort of way, thinking about the evidence from the field. And this, I think, is something which could be a very interesting avenue to explore for future work, is to return ourselves to the field and follow in the footsteps of those surveyors of 100, 200 years ago, in the case of the Ordnance Survey in Ireland, and to return to the field and think about the landscape as a focus for study ourselves and the legacies in that landscape of the work of the surveyors who created those maps, the maps which were so important to John Andrews and his work. So that's another possibility for us, I think, is to build upon a paper landscape and to build upon it by returning to the field, which I think, from hearing what we've just been hearing, would be something which would, I hope, appeal to John Andrews himself. Because, as I mentioned a moment ago, we see, I think, very much that rootedness as a geographer, a rootedness in the landscape, in the field, as a place where we can gain our understanding of the wider world around us. And what's important in all of this, of course, is collaboration. And the work of the Irish Historic Towns Atlas is a very good example of that, of linking across to different organisations, different individuals, different expertise, different disciplines, and working together. And my role as the chair of the British Historic Towns Atlas is something which I'm very keen to see, collaboration with the Irish Historic Towns Atlas. And I think, again, looking at John Andrews' contribution, I see that linking across the Irish Sea, the linking between Ireland and Great Britain through the maps, for example, and the surveyors that John Andrews was interested in, Bartlett, the Ordnance Survey, Roke, for example. So a continued collaboration, perhaps, is another enduring legacy for us. So I thank again Arnold for the lecture and for this opportunity. I thank the Royal Irish Academy and the Irish Historic Towns Atlas. And we will revisit that lecture, of course, I think, many times.